Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us in the Horror a Social Commentary presentation. We have a very talented person here with us. Let me give a brief presentation of Hannah Cates before we begin. Hannah Cates never means to get into trouble, but she always manages to do so anyway. As a full-time author and part-time ghost, she's chucked up misadventures all around the world. Between being shanghaied along with the French Foreign Legion, escaping Montenegrin castles, and eulogizing at rat funerals, she keeps herself busy. Hannah specializes in middle grade horror, but you can also find her penning tales of cowboy werewolves and insidious alpine hotels. When she's not writing, she's usually skulking around cemeteries, giving tours through haunted cities, or playing honky tonk piano. Welcome, Hannah. Thank you for joining us.
All right, thank you so much for having me, Brenda. And you guys have to forgive me. I was outside yesterday and I have a little pneumonia scarring. So if I cough in the middle, it's not consumption, it's not COVID, it's not the Black Plague. I just have lung scarring.
All right.
But I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me back. Gosh, last time I was with Right Hive, we talked about pacing attention. And when I got the invitation to talk about horror as social commentary, you guys don't know the can of worms that you just opened. I could talk about this all day. But are you a horror fan, Brenda?
Yes, I am. I actually have my little toe here.
Oh, yes! Oh, it's a tiny toe!
Yes, perfect match.
Oh my God, they're best friends! I'm so excited! It's amazing. So I'm so glad we've got horror enthusiasts here. It's a good audience.
Yes.
Honestly, to start this talk, I was thinking, oh, well, maybe we should go back to the roots of, is horror social commentary? Why is it? We're just going to skip all that. Horror is social commentary. It always has been social commentary. And if you guys want to argue with me, that's totally cool, but I'm not going to waste my time with that right now. This talk is going to be a little bit different from my last one. Like I said, I did pacing and tension, and that was really how to write in my last presentation. This is going to be about the what of horror and not the how. I want to go deeper into fear as one of our most powerful primeval human conditions. So to define what horror really is, we first have to take a look at the genre. I love that, Brenda, you got can you hold your Edgar Allan Poe up again?
Yes, of course.
I love him. He is considered to be the founder of modern horror, right? But the key word to that is modern. That's not to say that horror did not exist in a way that we didn't quite see it earlier than our boy Poe. I love him. He's really defined the whole haunted castle, the atmospherics, but he didn't invent horror, just the genre as we have come to know it. The fact is, life is horrific, and it has literally always been horrific. When you take a moment to really break down the human condition, we're always drawn back to the fact that we are societally controlled by fear. We have the fear of abandonment. We have the fear of poverty. We have the fear of judgment. We have the fear of not fitting in. Nearly every decision that we make or that we're told to make by, the countless influences that come into our lives, it has something to do with buying yourself a little bit more of the illusion that you actually have security in an utterly chaotic world. We use these things to make an illusion that we can control the things that we can't control. Like, are you aging steadily into death, where you'll finally have to come to grips with your morality and the fact that you're just carving chains and worm food? No worries. We've got age-defying beauty serum for that. You'll look 50 years younger. You can completely ignore the fact that we're all going to die. This is the society that we live in. We don't want the chaos. We don't want the fear. We don't want to talk about the inevitable. So we're afraid. We've always been afraid. We're fragile creatures, and we're constantly looking for a way to rationalize a world full of entropy. we like to pretend like we have control of things like the aging process or our finances or governments on the world stage. And we've been doing this as long as myth has existed. So are you familiar with the story of Hades and Persephone?
Yes, I am.
So
The power
that's a
races,
story.
right?
Yeah, that's a crazy story. And I'm so sorry to all my Lore Olympus fans because I know they take like a really romantic angle to it, but at its origin, Hades and Persephone is a tale of lust, kidnapping, abduction, and forced rape. You know, I know we love this story and everybody's like, oh, it's just so romantic, but literally this guy kidnapped her and took her to his palace of the undead, a cold, cruel place, and forcefully raped her. And she's forcibly taken as a sex slave and literally imprisoned in hell. That's horrific. Like, do you honestly think if Persephone hadn't eaten that stupid pomegranate seed that she'd be like, oh yeah, I'm gonna stay here with my rapist for like half the whole year? No, but your
No.
winter is scary. Those 6 months of darkness are scary for farmers, for people who are going to lose their one source of food. We need explanations for the things that we can't control. And so Hades and Persephone goes back to that we can't control the seasons. So we have to have an equally as horrible story to explain the horrible things that are already happening. But let's keep going. The Grimm brothers, right? Little Red Riding Hood. That is the original stranger danger story. Um, and when you tell kids don't talk to strangers, you tell them stories like that, right? Little Red Riding Hood, because you don't want to say, oh, don't talk to strangers because 460,000 children just in America go missing every single year. When you talk about, hey, kids, don't talk to people that you don't know, don't get in a van with a guy who wants you to help him find his puppy, you're not explaining the disappearance of children. You're not giving them the statistics of how many lost children are never found. You're never talking to them about what kind of people kidnap children for that reason. That's just not palatable. And that's the key word here. If we really cared about our kids, why wouldn't we be telling them stories about child molesters? Like, you really want to scare them? Then why aren't you telling them about these horrendous crimes that we see on the news every single day? Like I said, that's not palatable. We can't swallow that as a society. And that's why horror is so much more than a story. It's a coping mechanism. It's a lens through which we view the darkest corners of our own humanity. Creepy little nursery rhyme, Ring Around the Rosie. If you haven't listened to it, don't. It's creepy. It's a childhood song, but it's about the Black Death, this disease that literally culled, some people believe, as much as 60% of the population in Europe. So Ring Around the Rosie, the Rosie ring was the telltale rash that you have the disease and you are going to die. A pocket full of posies. They used to stuff posies in the dead's pockets and into their clothes to mask the stench of rotting flesh. So just imagine that for a moment, like bodies piled up in the streets, just sweltering so high you can't even see over them. The accounts of the Black Plague are crazy. And this grim, horrific reminder that your chance of survival is 50-50. That's a flip of a coin, Brenda. There's 50% that you are going to die tomorrow during the Black Plague. And I think this harsh reality, we're living through COVID. You know, it's not as foreign as you might think it is, that fear, that dreadful sense that we're not in control of our own bodies and our own health. So I'm not going as far as to say like Ring Around the Rosie is a horror story. That's not the point I'm trying to make. But we tend to classify horror by the way that it's written, not by what it actually is. So when we're talking about books in the literary world, we classify horror by the tension and slackening pace. And I talked about that in my last talk, which was literally pacing and tension. But in order to look at horror as social commentary, I think that we need to take a broader view, go beyond the limits of genre, and really talk about what horror is at its roots. What are we afraid of, and what is the damage that we're actually trying to address? Okay, so another terrifying story, the Pied Piper of Hamelin. It's an old grim story. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
I don't think so.
So it's a there's this quaint little medieval village, and one day a Pied Piper comes into town because this village happens to have like a rat problem. They're infested with rats, and the Pied Piper comes in and says, for a price, I'm going to use my magical flute to get rid of all the rats. And the villagers are like, yeah, whatever, dude. Yeah, go ahead. And he uses his magical flute to lure all the rats into the local river where they all drown. And the villagers are happy and they're all celebrating, but then they don't want to pay the piper for what he's done. So in revenge, the piper takes his magical flute and he lures all the village children into the river to drown. Pretty horrible
That's
story,
a plot
right?
twist.
It gets worse. It gets worse. Because part of it is actually true. Like, I kid you not, there's a deeper truth to this story. If you go visit the village of Hamelin in Germany, there are plaques dating back to 1602. One of them, it reads AD 1284 on the 26th of June, the day of St. John and St. Paul. 130 children born in Hamelin were led out of the town by a piper wearing multicolored clothes. After passing the cavalry near the Koppenberg, they disappeared forever.
Okay.
So like, yeah, this is historical record. And so historians are going like, what the heck is going on here? They've come up with a pretty good theory. So at about this time, Germany was suffering a severe economic downturn. The people were very poor. They were starving. There was very grave economic turmoil. Parents couldn't feed their children. And so the realm thought that a great way to deal with this was to expand. So they started colonizing, pushing out into Eastern Europe, like the areas of Romania. And they would send recruiters to these peasant villages because, people are well established. They have their farms. They don't want to leave. They would send recruiters who historically wore very bright, cheery clothes, and they were very well spoken, kind of like court jesters. And they would come into these villages and they would try to recruit citizens to go settle in this savage land, right? So then all of a sudden, years down the road, these very distinct German names start showing up in the wilds of Romania. You start piecing these puzzles together and you're like, wait, what happened here? Prevailing theory is that in recruiting the villagers to go colonize in these areas, the people who were recruited would receive a paltry sum. So why did 130 children disappear? It probably wasn't a magic flute. These parents probably sold their children to the government, Hunger Games style, and sent them away, never to be seen again because they couldn't feed their children. So I've got to ask, what truth is harder to swallow? That you sacrificed or that you sold? I don't know which one is worse. Your own flesh and blood to the government? Or that a magic man in a bright coat came and played his flute to have all your children drown in the river? It's awful. You're starting to, right? You're starting to pick up on these patterns, that these stories aren't just stories. These stories are the way that we cope with life. So let's dig a little deeper here. I know this is already horrifying. Let's go deeper into it. Beyond what you think of horror, and explore what really makes the genre what it is. I'm going to share my screen here for a minute. Let's go into some mechanics. Traditionally, Stephen King defines 3 types of horror. I'm going to go ahead and add in a 4th because I'm fancy like that. I add the jump scare. So the jump scare, the gross out, horror, and terror. So at the base level, I see that there's this jump scare, right? You don't know if something is coming, the music gets all tense, or maybe the music stops and then bah, it jumps out at you and everybody screams in the movie theater, back when we could actually go to movie theaters. And this is very primeval. This is locked into our DNA to be scared of sudden movements and things that we can't see. So imagine our primordial ancestors, thousands upon thousands of years ago, are out hunting, right? Two dudes out hunting, and they hear a rustle in the bushes. And one of the dudes thinks, oh, there's a really rustly bushes. And the other dude thinks, oh my gosh, rustle in the bushes. What rustles bushes? It's probably a saber-toothed tiger. The tiger's gonna eat us. We gotta get out of here. Which human survives?
The one that runs.
Our fear isn't necessarily a weakness. It's really a strength. It's an evolved trait that has kept us safe. So the jump scare like really manipulates that. It's very basic. The gross out, that's disease. That's something that's festering, something that's putrid, something that's bloody. And that's also another very learned fear. You look at animals who aren't afraid of disease, animals like rats, animals like vultures, things that eat carrion, right? They have specific microbes in their stomachs that can digest those diseases. A possum can eat whatever the hell it wants and it's not going to get sick. Humans are not that way. If you eat something that's rotten, you're going to get sick and die. If you go too close to a corpse that is diseased, you could very well get a transmutable disease and die yourself. So this fear of zombies, like that's where this comes from, is the fear of disease and rottenness. And then we go into horror, which is just, I build these, I say they're more sophisticated bits of horror as we go up. And horror, as a sophisticated tier of horror, is taking things into the imaginary plane, right? We're getting out of our instincts and more into our imagination. Horror is something that is unnatural. It's something that just isn't right. It's stretching your imagination, making you see something that your brain can't keep up with. This is the implausible. It's the unnatural. When Pennywise is twisting her shape into the Losers Club's greatest fears, and yes, Pennywise is a female. And I don't know, nobody else acknowledges that. Pennywise
Really?
is, yes, Pennywise identifies as a female. She lays eggs. So everybody's like, him. Nah, go read the book. She lays eggs. It's a her. It thinks of itself as a her. Come on. Anyway, it takes some, excuse me, these demon shapeshifters. They're confusing, but this
I'm mind blown.
right? More people should know that Pennywise lays eggs.
Yes.
The stretching and the shape shifting into things that are unnatural and we can't comprehend. That's where horror comes in. And that takes us to the most sophisticated part of horror as a genre, which is terror. And I wish I could explain this as well as Michael Stevens does, but he has a fantastic video. If you guys can go back and Google like, why are things creepy? This video is fantastic. But he talks about terror being ambiguity. So there's these two mountaintops. He says between the mountaintops of safety and danger, there's a valley of ambiguity. Our brains are developed to sense danger, right? We look at things and our little lizard brains are constantly trying to compete. Like, is this a threat? Is this not a threat? Should I be afraid? Should I not be afraid? Terror lies between safety and fear, where we're not quite sure if we should be afraid or not. So why do we hate masks? Why do we think that masks are creepy? Why do we think that clowns are creepy? Why do we like go on to Disney World and see those weird like little animatronics where they look, they look pretty human, but not quite human enough? Like, where does that come from? That uncanny valley, and that's terror. We don't like masks, not because we don't know what a mask is, but when somebody is wearing a mask, we can't excuse me, we can't quite tell if they're a threat or not. So one part of our brain is trying to justify, like if a man comes up to me in a mask, and this has changed a lot with COVID too, but let's say somebody comes up in a clown mask, right? And he comes up to me and I look at him part of my brain is going, is this person going to hurt me? Another part, the societally attenuated part, is trying to say, no, 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 it's just a person. You recognize them. They have two arms, they have two legs. This is a very normal looking person. But because I can't see that person's face, I don't know what their intentions are. So I get this feeling of terror, the two sides of my brain fighting to figure out if something is wrong or not. The best way that I have seen terror defined is walking into your bedroom to find everything exactly as you left it, but knowing that it's not your bedroom.
Okay.
Serving that feeling that something's just not right. So horror is social commentary because it not only breaks down the darkest parts of our humanity into these little digestible nuggets, it's also a reflection of our society. So I want to talk for a minute. I'm going to take a path you guys probably didn't think I would swing to. Let's talk about Black Lives Matter. I don't have any experience, obviously, being a Black male in America. But when we look at the injustices of the past and the present, it's really easy to see, especially in the past year. I mean, can we please validate the horror that the Black community feels each and every day in modern society? If you haven't, have you seen any of Jordan Peele's horror movies? Get Out or Us?
Yeah.
So
Yes, they are very good. I
Get
love them.
Get Out
Yes.
especially. And Black horror is such an incredible genre because it is a direct reflection of our society. Like I said, I can't speak for the Black experience, but you just have to look at just glance at the past to see the horror and the connection between the Black man and body snatching, right? Like literally, these men were plucked from their homes, taken somewhere new, had no control of their bodies, lost all their autonomy, and were made into objects. Like their bodies were not their own. Slavery completely decimated any control that they had over their bodies or any right they had to fight back. So there's a really great book called Between the World and Me. And the author, Coates, is writing to his young Black son. It's really good. It'll make you cry. But in that book, he states, in America, it is traditional to destroy the Black body. So this fear of a Black man losing his body is very, very real. And it's very, very tangible, not only in history, but today, when you're enslaved, imprisoned, or even pulled over by the police, there's a real chance that your body might be taken from you. So we look at Get Out, right? The idea, and it seems kind of ridiculous. We're like, oh, this is horrific. This is crazy. This is just such a strange idea. It's just a movie, right? And it is. But yes, but what about the fear behind it? Yes, the idea of like drinking your poison tea and being body snatched might be a little far from the realms of what we know to be reality. But when we look at the idea of privileged white men stealing a Black body, is that really too far off of what we see when we turn on the news? These stories are the real root of societal terror. And this is why I believe that we need to take horror past the genre and look at what the actual fear is. The question isn't, oh, well, what's the scariest thing I can come up with? What's the bloodiest? I want to ask, what is your damage? What are you truly afraid of? What is at the root of your humanity? Robert Eggers came out with a movie called The Witch. And the horror of the story isn't the baby eating witch that lives in the woods and is like picking off the children one by one. The story about this Puritan family is that their piety, their religious dogma won't save them and is actually ripping them apart from the inside out. Have you seen The Babadook?
Yes, I have actually.
so good. I was going to play a clip from it, but
Yeah.
I can't. But it's so good. There's that scene where she goes into the basement and she sees her husband, right?
Yes.
He tells her, like, bring me the boy. You can bring me the boy. The horror of this movie isn't like the waggly fingered monster in the basement. The horror of this movie is that this mother's unanswered grief, this unacknowledged grief, is poisoning her from the inside out, making her paranoid to the point of murder suicide. The secondary effect to which is it's driving her son to become violently sociopathic just to survive. That's the horror, not the monster. So, I mean, I hate to break it to everybody, but the horror is us. We are the horror. We are the monsters. And that's what we're most scared of. We have always lived in the castle. Horror is what we did and a reflection of our psyche. So if you really want to be scary, don't just try to think of some monster. Show people themselves. Give them a mirror. Classic examples. Frankenstein, right? One of the best horrors ever written. And let's not even mention the terrifying fact that nobody believed she had actually written it because she was a woman. That's a whole other story. But it wasn't far from the truth at the time. When Mary Shelley published Frankenstein, body snatching was actually a rife problem. Medical schools, they needed bodies. They needed corpses to teach their students, and it was you could earn a lot of money stealing a corpse and getting it to a medical school. So maybe you bury grandma one day and you go to school the next morning and she's lying on a slab cut open. Like, that's your Victorian reality. So there's a really famous story where actually President Benjamin Harrison was looking for a stolen corpse. It was a family member, and he broke into like the medical school's basement, and there was a body on the end of a pulley, and he thought it was like his cousin or his uncle or whatever, and he pulls the sheet back, and it was his father, who he had buried yesterday. Yeah, that's what our presidents are doing at the time. Gosh, but that's not even the worst part of it. Even with Frankenstein, this was also the time when scientists, cutting edge medical scientists, were exploring with ether and electricity. They found that if you electrocute the human body, it spasms, right? And they didn't know why. So they were taking hanged criminals for experiments with electricity, hooking them up to these batteries and watching these dead corpses electrified and claiming, oh, we've discovered the secret of life, we're gods, we're the greatest people ever, we're so smart. They thought that they discovered the secret of the soul when really they're desecrating corpses. This is what's happening every single day. So we look at Frankenstein, it's not that imaginative, it's really not that far from the truth. Dracula. Pretty much every modern vampire mythology stems from consumption, or what they call the White Death. So Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula, was actually very sickly as a child. He was in bed most of the time. And the White Death was very contagious. When family members would contract the disease because they're living in close proximity, long after their loved ones were buried, the local superstition concluded that the deceased was coming back to prey on the souls of the living. So I want you guys to go out and Google the New England vampire panic of the 1800s. Like, just check this out. It's crazy. Check out the name Mercy Brown and what these villagers were doing, blaming the dead and digging up corpses and then making loved ones eat the charred ashes of their dead loved ones. They would dig up, well, let me explain this better. They were digging up the dead loved ones who were assumed to be vampires. And for some reason, they thought the cure was burning the corpses down to ash and then making the family member eat the charred corpses.
Wow. Okay.
That's what this is literally history. This is what happened. And honestly, I think it's scarier than the Dracula story itself. I could literally go on and on. Horror is a mirror to our society. They take our nasty, unappetizing truths of our history and our humanity, and they force them down our throats in a way that we can swallow. So I think too that this is why children's horror is especially important And I get a lot of flack for writing children's horror. My mom, she uses the term warped. People ask me, what do you write, Hannah? I'm like, oh, I write scary books for kids. And they're like, oh, slowly backing away. But here's the thing. Being a child is the most terrifying experience that we all go through together. Being a child is the most vulnerable position you will ever be in. You don't control anything about your world. You don't control who your parents are. You don't control how they spend their money. You can't make your own money. You aren't educated. You are at the whim of literally everything else around you. You are a victim to your environment when you're a child. Back when I was a teacher, I had one student whose mother had been burned alive by her pimp. And this kid is 5. And this is the truth of his reality that he's dealing with, that his mother was set on fire and burned alive, and he's 5. So horror not only is a mirror to the awful parts of our society, it's also it has an undeniable aspect of survival, right? So I grew up in a home where I wasn't always safe. But growing up, I was afraid of everything. Like Brenda, I hated horror. I couldn't do scary stories in the dark. I couldn't do all of those things. I was scared of my own shadow. I constantly had nightmares. But when I left my home that wasn't always safe, I immediately plunged myself into a job that was very dangerous. And in my first career, I was almost killed 3 times. And honestly, I should be dead. It's really an amazing thing that I'm not dead. I should have died considering all the things that happened, and why I'm here is anybody's guess. But as I was in the hospital recovering from that 3rd incident, I picked up a pulpy comic called Preacher, and it was terrifying. It was gruesome and it was gory. Preacher is so good if you ever get across a graphic novel. It's not necessarily horror, but it drew me to that kind of genre, like a fly to honey, because this was a time where the violence that I had experienced against me didn't make any sense. I was trying to rationalize it and I just couldn't. But the violence that I saw in that story, that level of graphic, visceral blood, guts, and murder, somehow that made more sense than what I had gone through, because I could see the characters' motivations. I could see what was happening and why it was happening in the story. I could stomach that. I could lose myself in the character, and I could take off on a journey that reminded me that I'm stronger than I realized. So I was talking to my therapist about this one day, and I said, oh, I don't get it. Why do I like horror? And she said, well, Hannah, when you finish a slasher movie, do you feel like you survived? Light bulb just went off at the top of my head. Horror is about survival. And when you're growing up as a child in a world that doesn't make any sense, where you have no control, this can be not only comforting, but it can be empowering. So if you guys don't know anything about ACE experiences and you write for children, I highly recommend that you go to Google and research ACE, Adverse Childhood Experiences, and learn everything that you can about them. So an ACE childhood experience is, there's a variety of them, like abuse, neglect, seeing your parents be violent against each other, having a parent incarcerated. All of these things add up and have a huge effect on your childhood, so much so that if you have 4, I think it's like 4 or more ACE childhood experiences, you are 4 times more likely to be prone to suicide, depression, other types of mental illness, and you probably have more of them than you think. So when writing for children, I think this is a huge thing to keep in mind, how scary life is as a child. And some of your readers might not know where their next meal is coming from. I grew up with a mentally ill parent, and that comes with its own bevy of issues, and you start addressing the other components, the physical abuse, the alcohol abuse. So I've read The Shining several times, and what really strikes me about it isn't the whimsy and the ghosts, but the actual Torrance family. Brenda, have you read The Shining or seen the movie?
No, I just watched the movie. Yes, I haven't read it.
but you get the kind of story, right?
Yes,
So
yes.
Jack, the book is so good, and I think what Kubrick capitalizes on the more shallow aspects of the horror, where King's story goes so much deeper into the higher tiers. So in the book, it really lays out how Jack is reeling from his own past abuse. His father was abusive and alcoholic, not to mention that Jack is also struggling with being an alcoholic, his legal troubles, his marital woes. Danny is the victim of these manifestations. Jack's father has hurt him. Um, Jack is hurting Danny. You see this cycle, this chain of abuse. And poor Danny, he's also 5. He's a child just trying to survive. And there's a part in The Shining, I should have looked it up, gosh, where Danny's lamenting. He's like, I'm 5. I'm only 5. How am I dealing with all of my dad's problems? I'm just 5. And you know, what about Wendy? Poor Wendy. Everybody hates Wendy. She gets so much flack from these backseat drivers. Like, oh, why didn't you swing the bat harder? Why didn't you just leave when you knew something was wrong? Why did she do this? Why didn't she do that? Blah, 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 blah. Why didn't she just leave Jack when he broke Fanny's arm before they even went to the Overlook? So King does a great job of explaining this better and making Wendy an actual character. And the fact of the matter is, it's hard to leave an abusive partner. And when we look at Wendy, we see her as kind of like the helpless, back swinging damsel in distress.
Yeah.
But in the book, she's so much more. She's an actual person where her family is abusive too. Her mother is abusive. So in the book, you see her going through all of her options, right? Like, I am married to this man who's having a lot of issues right now, but he's kind of getting better. And I have a child with this man. And we want to gloss over the fact that a woman leaving an abusive, anybody leaving an abusive partner is difficult. Trust me, I've done it, and I wasn't even married to the guy, and it was awful. So if you haven't read the book, read it, because Wendy isn't the woe is me victim. She's shrewd, she's strong, she's cunning, and she's also the child of abuse. She's not only fighting for her survival, she's fighting to save her child from an entire hotel full of malicious, ghostly entities, including her psycho husband. Like, this poor woman. So the horror of this story isn't really the Overlook. The horror is this woman and her child are trapped in an abusive relationship by societal norms. The fact that, you know, she doesn't know how she could go get a job, how she can go provide for herself. She literally has nowhere else to go, and then physically trapped by the snowstorm at the Overlook. The horror is Jack being possessed by the evil of his past traumas, his inability to escape this terrible cycle of generational violence that his dad started, and, you know, it fed down to him, and now he's feeding to his child. So the book too is, I'm sorry, I'm mincing my words because I'm getting like so excited. You need to read this book because
I
Jack,
will.
well, as he slowly descends into violence, you get his inner monologue on how much he hates himself. Like, he knows the monster he's becoming, and he watches in horror as he becomes the very thing that he despised as a child, as he watches himself inflict the same amount of pain and violence that his father inflicted on him. That's terrifying. That's the real horror of The Shining. But in children's horror, I think, and especially in the case of Danny, even that's an adult horror, it's not necessarily about the trauma, it's about the triumph. What makes children's horror triumphant is survival. One of my mentors once told me, she said, hey, well, you know, a middle grade book is done when the character feels safe and loved. I said, okay, fine. You know, I ascribe to that. I think that's an interesting theory, but it says nothing about what that character has gone through, what they've overcome, what they've triumphed over, what they've survived. Life is scary, life is unpredictable, and no amount of piety or rule following is going to save you from the chaos of life. But horror also reminds us that we have the power to survive. And however we make it out, like by hook or by crook, Survival is something to be proud of. So my dear friends, if you want to write horror, I want you to look out in your society and ask yourself, what's your damage? And I don't know, Heather's fans out there, literally, what is your damage? People say, oh, well, I've got this idea for this terrifying monster, a very scary thing. It's going to be so gross. It's going to be so horrific. Okay, fine. That's a fine place to start, but go deeper. Get your mirror and hold it up to society and ask yourself, like, what is the real horror here? I'm going to button this up here in a second. One last thought. My current book on submission is called Cuckoo Bird, and it's a middle grade book. I'll just read you the blurb real quick. In a house of 7 kids, 12-year-old PJ McFarlane feels invisible. That is, until she's befriended by Avery Sykes, the new girl who bewitches everyone she meets. Smooth-talking, picture-perfect Avery is everything PJ's not. And when she starts wearing PJ's clothes, doing her homework, and seating herself in PJ's place at the dinner table, the mysterious new girl seems to fit into PJ's life even better than she does. But when a series of horrific accidents start plaguing the McFarlane siblings, PJ discovers just how far Avery will go to craft her perfect family and dispose of anyone who gets in the way. So I love this book. I know it's mine, so it's self-serving, but I love it because it's so raw to my own childhood. I very clearly remember when this idea came to me. I have a big family and I'm the eldest. And when my mom had just given birth to my sisters, who are twins, I was feeling really neglected. I remember that my mom had like this picture of me on her bedside table, and I walked into her room one day and my picture was gone. It was completely replaced with my little sisters. And I remember just sitting there, like tears falling down my cheeks when I opened the frame and I saw that she just put the new picture in front of mine. Now, I wasn't it wasn't that I didn't love my baby sisters. It wasn't that, I was jealous or wanted to get rid of them. I was just afraid. I was afraid of being replaced. Like, now that mom has these 2 other daughters, what about me? Will I get time? Will I get attention? Will my mom still read me stories at night? Like, what is going to happen to me now that the family dynamic has changed? So I could pitch Cuckoo Bird. I could say, oh, it's a book about a homicidal changeling bird monster. But that's not entirely true. The book is about a fear of scarcity. It's about the fear of not having enough, not getting enough time, not getting enough food, not getting enough attention. If my parents don't see me, if my parents don't protect me, how am I going to survive? The demon bird monster is the manifestation of my own fear. The Overlook is the manifestation of cyclic abuse in The Shining. The Babadook is the manifestation of stifled grief of the mother. So when you write horror and when you write scary things, because I hope you do, the world is very scary and scary things, I want you to ask, what's your damage? What is the real root of the horror? And I've gone on for very long, so that's about all I have to say.
Wow, that was amazing. I loved it.
Well, thank you so much for listening to me prattle on for almost an hour and being so patient.